Well, good evening and welcome to the Justice Ministry of St. Mary's sponsored conversation with an incredible person, lawyer, person of God, and witness to God's grace in the world, Almudena Bernabeu. This evening, we have the great opportunity to hear her story about a recent trial for justice that is decades in the dire need of happening. So, but yeah, before we get on to some of those specifics, what I firstly want to introduce is very briefly our one of our chief captains of our justice ministry, David Crossan here, who will be leading the conversation. And then, of course, our speaker and witness, Almudena Bernabeu. But before we get to that, I forgot I want to begin us with just a brief prayer from our Episcopal Book of Common Prayer. And what it actually is, it's one of our collects for special occasions, a collect being one of the prayers that begins a service. This is our collect for social justice. So if you would just join me for a moment in silence, and I will read this beautiful prayer. Almighty God, who created us in your own image, grant us grace fearlessly to contend against evil and to make no peace with oppression, and that we may reverently use our freedom. Help us to employ it in the maintenance of justice in our communities and among the nations, to the glory of your holy name. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Crossan to introduce our speaker, Almudena. I'm going to disappear in the background, but if you do have a question or a need, please chat it in the chat box and I will be here to respond to that. And when appropriate, David Crossan will invite questions in that format as well. David, please, I turn the camera over to you.
Thank you, David. We have enough Davids in St. Mary's Church now that David Erickson I refer to as David the Great, and I'm David the Less. So delighted to be here tonight. Welcome to our discussion with St. Mary's parishioner, Almudena Bernabeu. Ms. Bernabeu is an honored international civil rights attorney and founder of the Guernica Group, which has prosecuted international civil rights crimes around the world. Almudena holds an LLM degree in international law from the University of Valencia. She's a member of the Valencia and Madrid Bar Associations and of the American Bar Association. And she has served as Transitional Justice Director at the US-based Center for Justice and Accountability. Last month, Almudena's team secured a landmark conviction in a Spanish court related to an infamous execution on Salvador 31 years ago. She continues to work on a wide variety of international civil rights issues around the world. Welcome, Almudena.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure. Thank you both, Davis. It is really an honor to be here.
The format we'll use tonight is this will be a discussion between Almudena and me. You please use the chat box function to ask questions. And if you do not get that question answered immediately, it may be because it's already going to occur later in the discussion, or we'll save it for later in the at the end of our discussion. You will note, for those of you who are still Zoom challenged, there are icons down at the bottom for both chat and for reactions. Chat you use to ask questions or make comments, and the reactions allows you to put an applause or a thumbs up on anything on your screen for anything that you feel warrants that. So use the icons as you would like. With those details out of the way, let's dive right in. Welcome again, Almudena. 6 weeks ago, a Spanish court convicted Inocente Orlando Montano of murders he committed in El Salvador in 1989. Now, we Americans have notoriously short attention spans. Probably the only thing that most of us remember of the Salvadoran Civil War is the murder of Bishop Oscar Romero, or at least we remember the movie. So Almudena, would you remind us exactly what the Civil War in El Salvador was all about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again. It is an honor. I realize I'm a new member of St. Mary's, so this is particularly special to me. It's a very, cannot imagine a better way to get to be known. Hopefully, people like it. Let's see really quickly, because I think that we will go deeper as we talk about the case. And I think most people may remember El Salvador being in Central America at a moment where probably towards the end of the Cold War was strategically positioned after the Sandinistas won the war in Nicaragua. In the context of the priorities, frankly, of the United States and the geopolitical interest of the United States in the so-called fight against communism as an ally. And it's because, and the historians and people that know more than me about this tell you, they did have a guerrilla or a rebels group that was as strong, if no more, perhaps, and organized, and had the chances of being successful even more than the Sandinistas. So that kind of panic, if you wish, that the communism was going to take the region, put the El Salvador in a situation of being, allow me with these words, but I think it's easier for people to understand, like a favorite child of the United States agenda, which translated into a lot of money, a lot of economic financial aid to a lot of forces that became very powerful, very wealthy, naturally, but also quite equipped and trained. So that precipitated this civil war that lasted about, they call now internal armed conflict. I don't think that there's much contradiction there, but they lasted about 10 years. It has been said, just because to frame it with your comment that I think is extremely wise, it is kind of framed now by Salvadorans that the war began with the assassination of Archbishop Romero in March 1980 and ended, ironically, with the assassination of the Jesuits, we will talk about in this case, in 1989. It really marked the beginning and the end in different reasons that perhaps belong more to history classes and for people more qualified than me, but it's interesting how those figures mark that terrible period for the country.
Thank you. That's a great summary. So within this civil war, within this context, who is Inocente Orlando Montano, and what did he do?
That's kind of a follow from the previous question. It's fascinating to me. Perhaps I hope everybody finds it as fascinating as the United States was obviously changing presidents, and I think other countries were criticizing some of the policies. It was this, I call it the volume wheel, with the financial aid and the requirements on protecting human rights. So when the criticism was very high that the armed forces were committing horrible human rights violations, then President Reagan, or most likely, President Bush father, will say, whoa, we are conditioning the help for you to have a better human rights record. So what happened towards the mid to late 80s is that the armed forces that had been in power absolutely uninterrupted since 1979, very, very clever. They found a formula, which is to keep the United States happy, was to get a civilian president. So they found some men. They didn't lack power, but they certainly were not powerful presidents perhaps in the sense that we may imagine in other democracies or other countries. And they kept all the positions in the government, vice president, minister of justice, and so on and so forth, being high command members or members of the high command of the armed forces. So they would all be colonels and generals. In 1989, and they were, as I said, very clever because they found a way of, when there was some demands from democratic countries, they will send the civilian president. When they were in their home country, they were war men, and they very much handle everything as war men. So in 1989 was not different, and there had been at the time a lot of demands, and President Carter was gone, but very critical of the situation in El Salvador. And they had the most important, perhaps, promotion of the army, men in their probably my age now, early 50s, late 40s, very powerful generals, and a civilian president. So it was a little small group of 6 men, to make it not too long, sorry, but 6 group of powerful military, and Montano belonged to one of them. And as the evidence show later, they had this tradition of making all the decisions in this joint way. And he belonged to the small group that made the decision and kind of ordered and orchestrated the assassination of the priest and the 2 women.
Okay, so I can't help but note some irony that Montano's first name was Innocente.
Isn't that something?
He certainly was. He certainly wasn't. His crimes were committed in El Salvador, and yet he was convicted in Spain. Could you explain to us how this happened?
Yes. Little background, if you allow me. Hopefully, tell me if I'm taking too long, please, David. But little background is this. There's something that perhaps became really famous in the 1990s when Augusto Pinochet, former dictator from Chile, was found in the United Kingdom, and there was an extradition request to Spain. That's just to kind of contextualize a little bit. So that possibility, which in the United States, because they don't like universal jurisdiction since Guantanamo and since other moments, they call extraterritorial jurisdiction, not to be overly technical, is the ability of a country to to establish jurisdiction, to use their national courts to investigate and prosecute, if that is the case, crimes that took place somewhere outside. And many times that the victims are not even US citizens, or that the perpetrator is not a US citizen. That crazy idea that today, unfortunately, this world doesn't like, and politicians have come to undermine quite a bit, was this absolutely beautiful idea of the Enlightenment in the 1800s. That some crimes were so egregious, so horrible, that they needed to be prosecuted or investigated. Doesn't matter what the circumstances were, you had to assert jurisdiction. So that, to me, which I think is a sign of progress that we've been digressing since, is a little bit of the basis for Spain initially to be able to do this case. Since then, as I kind of hinted, these laws have been undermined by different political, interest and international pressure from countries like Israel and China, etc., who don't want their officers prosecuted. And Spain was left with these, as the case was filed initially, in part because 5 of the Jesuit priests, and we will get there, 5 of the 8 victims that this crime generated were born in Spain back in the 1950s. That allowed us to assert jurisdiction. And Spain couldn't, because of the crime being of a state terrorism, that I know sounds a little weird, but we can go, if it's interest on that, it's not that weird. It's when you kind of use the power of the state to kill people. But which was kind of, to me, one in this case. But because of that crime and because of the Spanish nationality, we had a little opening for jurisdiction of Spanish courts. If you allow me, I know that it's just another thing that is interesting, was fascinating in this case, and I want to highlight that, is that in Spain, we don't have the ability to have a trial if you don't have the defendant sitting on the bench. It's what is called in absentia prosecution. In other countries that allow that, absolutely not in Spain. He has to be there, flesh and blood. So the chances of these cases going to trial are so thin, because it's hard to get all the defendants to be extradited. We really had this possibility because, against all odds, the United States Department of Justice and Department of State agreed to extradite a colonel from El Salvador to a third country, Spain. So that's perhaps what, to me, is in my dear heart, that was absolutely unthinkable. And it happened under this administration, no less.
So my memory is that he was extradited from the US to Spain. Is that correct? How did he get to the US? Is that correct?
That's right. And that was kind of the, being in El Salvador and not being a US citizen or a resident. Well, the first thing that I think people know, and I remember attending at St. Mary's an event that this was said loud and clear, is that the United States became a safe haven for many of these military as the dictatorships and the civil wars in that region were closing. And I think there's exceptional people in this country kind of still screaming about this and saying this is not tolerable, but they did get protection and they did get status and were able to be happy ever after. His situation is different. His sister lived in Massachusetts, in Everett, and he decided to move, and then being a Salvadoran military, he lied 7 times, no one, not two, I always say this, 7 times in his application for the TPS, the temporary protected status, that actually the social justice ministry, if nobody else, I know they're very familiar, something that is really a conquest of the Salvadoran community, and that every year they need to fight for Congress to approve it again. You know better, David, both of that struggle. And he lied 7 times. And he lied when they was asked, have you ever been a member of any armed forces or armed group? He said, no. And then, of course, there was the basis for the United States Department of Justice to file for perjury. And that's how the perjury, we helped as much as we could on the perjury, David, and there was a relationship with the Department of Justice, and they agreed, obviously evidence and bilateral treaties and legal briefing after they agreed to grant his extradition to Spain.
Okay, thank you. Now, to a sort of aside, TPS was actually created to some degree to welcome the people who were victims of people like him. And
Absolutely.
And my memory is that the Trump administration is just is threatening to, or has already sent back several 100,000 people who were here under TPS. Am I correct?
Yes, and it's being, as I mentioned, even under Obama, I think that was easier, but it is, I know, and that's what I want to, throw my kind of blessings and my admiration to the Salvadoran community, that they need to fight it every year. So it is not taken for granted. And for people to know, it allows them to live and work legally, but it doesn't allow them to travel. So it's not giving the entire rights or civic rights, or as we will enjoy them if you are a citizen or a legal resident. So it is limited, so to speak, but it's still, it's better than nothing. Naturally, it allows you to work, your children go to school, and everything else that comes with a pseudo legal status. But he took advantage. But that tells you his quality as a human being, without me having to go into it. This Montano, yeah.
Okay, so my memory is this isn't the first time by any means that a Spanish criminal court has claimed universal jurisdiction. I'm trying to remember, there are some cases back a few years ago. Do you remember those, or can you?
Absolutely. I mentioned the original one that kind of broke, original in the sense that it was not the first, but it was the one that was known internationally because it precipitated an extradition request to the UK government of Augusto Pinochet, which everybody may remember, who did a coup or gained power through a coup d'etat in 1973 in Chile. Then the first one was actually against an Argentinian military, also member of the military junta. They ran the country from 79 on. And then the third one that I was involved, perhaps they gained a little bit of international recognition because of a trial later, or because precipitated a trial later in Guatemala, was against Efraín Ríos Mon, former president of Guatemala, for the Mayan genocide. And so Spain has been in these kind of polls of being very, what I want to say, very advanced and very daring in bringing these kind of cases, but also suffering perhaps some of the deepest backlashes as a consequence. So it's being, a labyrinth for a lawyer. What I think, it's not because it's my case and I'm very proud, and so don't take it that way, but the importance of this trial is perhaps bigger than the previous is, because in all these cases, Spain only had 2 trials. So this is the second trial. So in all these more than a decade of this kind of efforts, in this trial, in the previous trial, the defendant made a mistake, really. He was a witness that tried to bargain with the prosecutors, ended up changing his testimony, and then he was thrown in jail. This case has, as I said, it's not because I'm in the United States or because I live here, or because I think it should be applauded. This case has a third country agreeing to extradite a defendant, honoring the right of another court. Unthinkable. And I think that provides, first of all, for hope that maybe these trials happen more often, that there is possible that the perhaps most antagonistic country in the world when it comes to international human rights and international criminal law, in fact, did the right thing. So I think that's the quality. I mean, I know it sounds very pretentious against my case, but I think there's a case that it really has all that relevance.
Well, I think you have every right to be proud and feel good about what you've just accomplished. Are there any other countries that are active using this this theory of universal jurisdiction or extra territorial jurisdiction? Is anybody else as active as Spain is on this?
Yes, and actually it's a new moment, and I think renewed energy in this regard. Germany has been leading on the Syrian cases on behalf of Syrian refugees residing in Germany, but for the torture and abuses committed in jails under the Bashar, something that is very recent and that we are still seeing every day on TV. Argentina, of all countries, has a very generous universal jurisdiction provision and has been doing some of the most interesting cases. So it's actually something else, that when people confront this with fear or with doubt on committee or on sovereignty and how countries are going to lose power and all the criticism, it actually is interesting. The most national jurisdictions, most countries, whether common law or the continental civil law tradition, have this provision.
Okay, so what you talked about extraterritorial jurisdiction and universal jurisdiction. Are those, how do they differ?
Well, legally speaking, they're very different. Universally, we had, which is how we began in 1996, and it's all since then gone, provided, and that's the clause, provided that only the crime will trigger jurisdiction, or only the crime will be, the relevance and the gravity of the crime will be the defining element for asserting jurisdiction. No other qualification. Doesn't matter who the victims are, where they live, where their nationality is, where the defendant or defendants are. That was the real universal jurisdiction and the way we know it. And I think it came out of the Convention Against Torture. The idea is after Nuremberg, after the genocide that happened in the Holocaust, but also reviving the Armenian and some others, and after the situation of the Americas war, the Americas torture and the use of counterinsurgency and techniques, etc., there will be only the crimes will trigger jurisdiction, and we will never allow this to happen again. Then, as many may remember, then lawyers, probably well-intended lawyers, there's many of us there, and sometimes we can be very clumsy, and some lawyers file cases against Rumsfeld, what was the name? The Rumsfeld, and then cases against the president of Israel. And then when those cases, the very powerful men came into Belgian courts and French courts and Spanish courts, then the limitations began. And now extraterritorial is the accepted term, which means I can reach, sometimes I can reach out of my country, or you can come to my country and use my courts, but with a lot of limitations. And that's what you have in the US. For instance, when you have Islamic terrorism, you could use a U.S. court, but it's not necessarily a universal jurisdiction kind of perception of things. I hope that's clear.
So that the extraterritorial jurisdiction would be what the United States uses to claim authority to hold people in Guantanamo?
I lost you there for a minute. I'm so sorry.
No, the extraterritorial jurisdiction, is that what the US uses to hold people in Guantanamo and to try them there?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
There's crimes that took place abroad because of the Anti-Terrorist Act of the United States is extraterritorial, so they bring it to the United States.
Okay, thank you. That helps. Now, in the same way, could someone hold a country claim universal jurisdiction or either one of these or extraterritorial jurisdiction to hold accountable American officials who order torture Guantanamo or American officials who administer involuntary hysterectomies to immigrant women within detention centers in the United States? Could that be used in reverse?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Round yes. And it's been tried many, many times. And I think that is in part, I'm not going to blame the United States only for that, but that's a huge part of why these provisions in different countries have been deeply undermined. And that is why, for those who are paying attention right now, of another nonsense of President Trump, in my opinion, which is sanctioning anything related to the International Criminal Court. And anybody who is related to the International Criminal Court is their fear that this body, which I think is, as again, sign of progress and very important for all of us, it's the fear is that they will go after US officials. And during the Iraq War and other, terrible happenings of the last 2 decades, there were attempts because things were done very unilaterally and against international law by the United States. And yeah, that's when they started chopping it.
And the United States does not accept the authority of the International Court, is that right?
That's right. They actually, just an irony that I'd like to teach my students when I teach, the International Criminal Court, when you think about the way it's run, the prosecutors that work there are all US educated JD lawyers. It's a complete American system design. It's accusatory. It's like a Department of Justice in a tiny version. And yet, when they realize, when with Bush son, they design the Rome Statute. So it was pushed by the United States. And I like to say this because it's a contradiction that allows me to sometimes make peace with living in this country for 21 years. But it's they really push to create that amazing, I think, step for humanity. They design it, they put the money, they made it possible. And one day they say, we're not going to sign it. And they are not subscribers. So you could potentially bring to the ICC a US official under the Security Council vote. I mean, but very unlikely. Bottom line, they don't want it, and they're going to do everything to push back.
So this is not something we have pulled out of, it's something we never signed.
That's right.
Okay. All right, thank you. I want to remind people that you are welcome to put your questions in the chat box, and I will get to them at an appropriate time. I have one from Janet Parker. I want a little clarification on that, and then we'll ask that. I want to go, while I'm waiting for questions, Almudena, much of the work on this specific case was done by the Guernica Group, which you founded. Can you tell us about the Guernica Group?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that opportunity. You mentioned on my bio, I was a litigator, that's all I know to do. And I was a litigator at the Center for Justice and Accountability which was really my beginning. It's a wonderful organization at 20 some years old. I was there for 16 of those 21, so I had to go. No, but just too long. But it was beautiful because I think it was at a moment when all of these cases and international criminal law was developing and so forth. And then over the years, and this is a privilege, I have to confess, well, the best part of this work is the people that you know in the process. Oh my goodness, we need 3 days to be able to tell you. But it's been the best part, and then you discuss it, and that's what I love. I love to go into countries and engaging with the locals and understanding the national context and take the polls, if you allow me, not be the foreigner that comes and parachutes, just kind of from the bottom up. And litigation allows you to do that, but the process prior is heavy. And with all due respect and having all the love that I have for CJA, it was a group of lawyers not really thinking that way, not suited to make that transition. And as I turned 40 many, I decided that it was the time to give it a try to a group. We had 100 conversations, by the way, with a lot of religious leaders, many in this call know and love, and about how to do this work in another way. And Guernica responds to all these colleagues and friends telling me, jump in the pool. I mean, you can do this work. So Guernica is a group of lawyers, but not only that, we have sociologists, we have one philosopher, we have the former UN rapporteur on transitional justice. Part of the staff is like we're trying to conceive accountability strategies and try to support countries in this same kind of redress, responsibility establishing, restorative justice, but engaging everything, allowing from a very early stage and way prior to whether we go to court. I'm not starting my work thinking we're going to file a criminal case. We're going to listen to these people. We're going to create conducive groups. They're going to be led by the nationals. So we're going to stay there. And it is really, I always say, it's not different. It's not doing something different. It's doing it in a very different way. And that's good. And then just so to finish, the idea was to formulate a nonprofit organization in the US that will take, because the victims have to be assisted no matter what, and they shouldn't be charged or for any service or legal service. I mean, this is really a public vocation, but we enlisted a group of litigators in the UK, European and American, in this chambers model to have the best legal expertise. And I'm not talking about myself. I got some of the best in the field, and I persuaded them to be part of Guernica. And that's what I have. I think we have the best of two worlds, the ability to respond to these needs with the best lawyering possible when the time comes.
And you may have just touched on this. There's the Guernica Group, there's the Guernica Center for International Justice, and there's Guernica 37 International Justice Chambers. Can you? I
know, and it's confusing, isn't it? But that was the idea. Well, the idea is that it's kind of a spin-off, if I may, from my previous experience. When litigation in U.S. courts takes place, and see if there's anybody in the call that knows my previous tenure doing Alien Torta Statute, is extremely expensive. So as a non-profit, and it was always this tension or stress, I don't know how to say, that we're not going to be able to meet with the victim's need for the time. We're talking about 12-year litigation. And we always relied on pro bono counsel from big law firms. And that can happen in the United States because I think there's a huge pro bono tradition, and like philanthropy is way more developed than many other countries. So and I had wonderful pro bono, including my husband today that I met doing a case. So wonderful pro bono counsel and pro bono support, but there was always something missing. And I will be quite honest, and I hope I don't hurt any sensible. The nonprofit doesn't have the resources to educate and prepare lawyers at the level the law firms do. And the law firms don't, the lawyers of law firms, because of their own pressure and numbers and need, don't have the time and the ability to immerse themselves in the national realities as some of these litigation needed to be successful. And when talking, as I said, Guernica is a product of many, many conversations, and I'll confess glasses of wine. But when finally came about was the aspiration of both. Some lawyers in private practice, they needed to be more involved in what a nonprofit can do, and nonprofit lawyers wishing they could have some of that expertise. So we checked even with donors to see if this was feasible. And they told us, it's a great model, let's give it a try. So we have a law firm in London. They, as I said, because of Chambers being a very liberal structure, includes lawyers from the United States, South Africa, the UK, France, Syria right now, and Spain, naturally. And then we have the nonprofit, more traditional, run as a nonprofit, for which we have to do fundraising and we have to do all the more traditional things in the United States. It's a 501c3 here.
Thank you. That helps. We have one person that says they're having a little trouble hearing, that the sound is coming a bit garbled or something. So I'm going to ask you to speak a tad slower, and maybe I don't know if there's anything else we could do, but thank you, whoever brought that to my attention. I have, just for, again, because I think Americans are infamous, we're famous for our short memories and bad high school history courses, which are usually taught by somebody whose first name is Coach. Could you remind us why you intentionally chose the name Guernica, for those who don't remember?
Yes, I have to apologize. I'm going to try to speak, but I speak very fast and I have a very strong Spanish accent, so it's a little hard. But so actually, if there was two things, the history and the personal history. The history is that many may remember that in 1937, Spain was in his first year of the Spanish Civil War when the Franco, the leader of the fascist army, engaged with Hitler and with the Italian aviation at the time under Mussolini to punish, I would say, it was a kind of a test, to punish the Basque people, who is not, I'm sure everybody has heard sometime in life how resilient and strong the Basque people are. Even this is a cliche and a generalization, but I think they should be very proud. It was a part of Spain that had resisted the fascist army and had effectively confronted them, probably created more casualties than any other pueblo, and Franco hated them. So he orchestrated this bombing. At the same time, Hitler had these new planes, bomb throwing. I don't know any military words in English, I apologize, but it was a legion of planes, and they decided to do this bombing. And they picked, and I say this not to be, not in a humorous way, but I mean, they really were deliberate. They pick a market day, that if anybody can imagine a market day in the 1930s in my little country, will be mostly women and children. And because the men are working fishermen, this is a very modest town. And everybody gathered in one place. Isn't that convenient? So they bombed the town of Guernica, destroy completely. They killed 1,600 people, mostly elderly, children, and women. And, it's known because Pablo Picasso, the painter, decided, horrified by this, living at the time in exile in Paris, did this famous frame that I don't think it needs an introduction of me, but the bottom line is that the government actually, or whatever that was, the fascists tried to hide it and tried to deny that actually that happened. So to the pain was the offense. And when I was working in El Salvador, who is not with us anymore, but a Jesuit priest a colleague and brother of the Jesuits who died. So that brings everything together. We are talking, John de Cortina, maybe many may know, but those would have, because he founded the organization that was specializing or the focus on finding the children that were illegally adopted during the Salvadoran Civil War. And he was very successful. He found a number of them. Anyway, we became really good friends. He was a man of the most extreme modesties I've ever met, a man who had been, was good friends with Monsignor Romero, was good friends with Rutilio Grande, the first Jesuit assassinated in El Salvador, held the photos of the photographer later assassinated during the Romero. There's those famous photos of Romero being shot and in blood. He held them for years until it was safe to publish it. I mean, it's like someone, and he will tell you this little by little. He was like, what? It's like, oh yeah, I was there. So in one of my last conversations with him, and I adore him, one of those with wine, I shouldn't be, but one of those in which I was giving up. This work is so hard that I told him, John, I don't think I can do this. I just can't do this. Because I don't know, I had been hit right and left probably, which is more common than none in this profession. And then he said something that I will never remember. I will never forget. And I never, ever, ever thought even once about doing anything else than this. And he says, but if you don't do it, who is going to do it, Almudena? Just think about that. So I think that he saved my career, but that in that conversation, he says, and by the way, I said something about Guernica. Oh, Guernica, he says, I survived the bombing. Like, what? It's like, yeah, I was with my grandmother. He will probably be in the 70s when this. And he said, I was in the market with my grandmother, forgive me, and she passed, but I survived. And when the time came to do this, so many friends and, in this concentrated project of Guernica, it couldn't be called anything else.
That's an amazing story. That's absolutely an amazing story. I don't know where to go now. I will say as a personal side, if anyone this evening has the opportunity to see Picasso's painting, Guernica, is at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid, do so. But be prepared. It's going to bring you to your knees. It's an amazingly powerful thing. But that story is one of the most moving things I've heard in a long time. Thank you for sharing.
My pleasure. No.
I wanted to go back for a minute. You talked about being director of the Transitional Justice, the Center for Justice and Accountability. One of our parishioners, Nancy Clark, has been active with the center, supporting it for many years. And I think maybe even traveled with you and the center to El Salvador a few years ago. So a couple of questions. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Center for Justice and Accountability? And then we'll go on from there about what you're doing now.
Okay, of course. So the Center for Justice and Accountability was founded in 1998. I joined it in 2001, and it was founded by Jerry Gray, who sadly, and was a dear friend, passed only a few weeks ago. He was a psychologist, and he was an expert on post-traumatic stress and the disorder, and had been working with Central America particularly, not alone, obviously victims from many countries. The Balkans War were kind of closing. But the Central America community and the solidarity movement had been so strong in the Bay Area that even though it was never an organization that was born with a focus on Latin America, Central America, it was inevitable to focus so much on that. And what they did, and people may remember these cases, they used to be, we still have them, but unfortunately, as I was saying before, they were deeply undermined by the Supreme Court of the United States. There are two torts acts in the United States called the Alien Torture Statute and the Torture Victims Protection Act. They have been they were created, to fight international crimes such as piracy and things like that. And then they were parked for many years in a parking lot and then revived in the 1970s with the famous case Filariga, a case that had to do with a Paraguayan torturer in the United States, which this typical story that was found in a supermarket, a victim identified him, and then a beautiful number of lawyers, all of them my mentors, from Center for Constitutional Rights in New York to Paul Hoffman in Southern California, these legends of lawyer-activism, and the most coherent human beings, I think, in the world decided to come together and support initiatives such as the Center for Justice and Accountability. And it began, you may remember, so it brings us back to El Salvador, and please cut me if it's too long, but it is important because this really is why I'm here 20 years later. They took four religious women from different denominations, had been killed also in 1980, raped and brutally killed in El Salvador. One of the women, Ita Four, whose brother was from New York, a lawyer, a wonderful lawyer. The family is a dear family and still supportive and friends. And well, he took investigating the killing of his sister as a personal matter, and reach out to lawyers and people from different organizations. I would like to mention the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. I mean, a number of people before my time, they considered bringing this alien torte statute case against two generals from El Salvador, former ministers of defense living in Florida, in Palm Springs or whatever that is named, one of those places. And then that case was brought, and it was unfortunately, and I read somewhere, Professor Terrekal, who's a dear friend and my star witness, so I'll go there later, but I think they gathered good evidence, the investigation was great, but they lost. There was a jury trial, and the plaintiff side, the victim side lost. Many speculations. I do believe is that the law, particularly on command responsibility, was not developed enough for a jury to understand that a commander could be made responsible for the killing of a bunch of soldiers and police officers. But then just to go fast forward, years later, the Center for Justice and Accountability was founded around the possibility of bringing these cases again, perhaps having understanding the statutes differently, and they tried, and they filed a case against the same generals, but this time, which I thought it was spectacularly, I think the key, this time on behalf of 3 torture survivors from El Salvador, 3 human beings who had gone through hell, 3 people that I love, Juan Romagoza, Neris Gonzalez, and Carlos Mauricio. And then they themselves testify at trial. They explain what happened to them. I think Professor Terrekal and many other wonderful witnesses, and then they won. And so the Center for Justice became this organization. I was lucky enough to be in all that machinery to specialize on alien torture statute, TVPA, if you wish, ATS TVPA, cases against individual defendants. And I think we were quite successful. So I appreciate that question. It was a roller coaster. And it taught me everything I know.
David, you are muted. David Erickson from Beyond the View. And we do have a couple good questions in the chat box if you're able to read them.
We will get to them. And I want to follow up on this question, then we'll get to them. Can you tell us what you mean by transitional justice when this organization is involved in it? I know you're doing work in Colombia, and I think maybe some other, and maybe even the Mideast right now. What does transitional justice mean?
Right, transitional justice is young. All things considered, as a concept and as a process, so to speak, is fairly young. And I like to say, and I think it's not only true, that I think we should be all aware, it was really created in the Latin American region. I mean, it is something, I think it is thanks to the victims. If anybody, I mean, it's hard to explain these things, and I should not take more than a minute, but if you look across the spectrum in Latin America, from the early conflicts down south, Chile, Argentina, and you come up on the way to Guatemala, they closed in 1996, What you have for me that is a common element or a common denominator are victims whose resilience and desire for justice is one, never ending. I mean, it's just extraordinary. But two, that for them, and sometimes I wonder as I'm getting immersed in Africa, am I going to see the same? But in Latin America, that I love and know a little bit better, justice is official, is formal, is in court, is with a judge and a prosecutor. So it's the judicial truth. This has to be. So as the dictatorships and the military regimes were closing, these civil society and these victims start demanding, in some, you have different levels, and you have, in each country is different, but they started demanding a process. They will have to have a measure of truth, a measure of justice, a measure of accountability, which for them, as I said, it was court, and then of course reparations if that is the case. Now that kind of developed, and trying to, I don't mean to be oversimplifying, but that developed in a science today, part of social science, which is a transitional justice process, and it is said where the minimums of every single process after massive violence, state-inflicted violence or wars, for a society to come back to terms, to come back and heal from that period, such process has to take place. Now, I want to say, because I'm a big opinionated person only in a couple of things, but this is one of them, that it cannot be the same everywhere. Perhaps one of the scenes of the last 5 or 10 years is that we think that it should be like a tool, like a bucket, truth, justice, and reconciliation. No. I think religion, I think beliefs at many levels. I think that the inequality, the composition of countries, they define these processes to be quite different depending on the country. And the Colombians are so, legalistic and so formal that they have a whole new jurisdiction called the Special Jurisdiction for the Peace, which is de facto, they have created 35 tribunals more than the ones that the country had. So every country has to find their way, but that is the bottom line, that it cannot be done. Peace cannot be achieved and non-recurrence guaranteed if it's not truth, justice, accountability, and reparations, or in that order, or whatever order.
So another word for it might be a reconciliation process.
Reconciliation, I think, is first of all, I think it's more of an option. I think that you see that in processes. South Africa always wanted a reconciliation. You may remember, including, Bishop Desmond Tutu, who I love and admire, and that they thought that was for them precisely because of the racist, if you ask them, component, that will be the way. Many years after that, we are at a moment in South Africa where victims of both sides, so to speak, are asking for justice in a different process. But reconciliation is part of that. And I think reconciliation should be a goal, not an excuse to not have justice or to not have truth, if you know what I mean. I mean, I know that this is a bigger conversation, but I fear sometimes when reconciliation is used to, frankly, on the side of like, it's when a perpetrator tells me, let's don't open the wounds. I always ask him, whose wounds, yours or the victim? Isn't that a call of the victims who you harm, or your call as a perpetrator? So those can be complex things.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to a question here. This is a very specific one from Janet Parker. She says her friend Terry Carl. Do you know Terry Carl? Okay.
Of course, very much.
Good, because that makes this question make sense. Terry worked on this case for 30 years. I don't know which case she's talking about. And you must know her well. Said that he is appealing based on her testimony. I don't. Maybe you have some.
I'll give you a little context. Professor Terry Carl, I think everybody should. She's actually local in San Francisco, so it's very important. She was a Latin America chair at Stanford, and she became over the years, and I think I mentioned it to her in the context of the Ford case. We had actually did the case from the killing of Archbishop Romero, and then another, the Carranza case, another El Salvador, and then the Jesuits. And Professor Carl had been an expert witness in all of those cases. Her extraordinary work, and I don't know if there are two in this country, to be honest, is that she has become, I call it the magic reader. But as President Clinton declassified documents from the different government agencies in relation to Central America and the conflicts in the Americas, Professor Carl is one of the pioneers in understanding how to read and interpret these documents. And under every country's rules, I don't mean to speak like a lawyer, but there's an exception of relevance and admissibility when you have documents that are directly coming from government agencies, as one of the hearsays rules, if that sounds. Anyway, but nobody understands those documents. They are redacted. Sometimes they are the same document declassified 5 times and redacted in 5 different pieces. So it's like a puzzle. So she became an expert on spending the time to read them, to understand the human beings' details. A lot of them, for me, the most fascinating perhaps, are the communications between the Department of State and the different embassies in the different posts in the different countries. Fascinating, because it was the ambassador's interpretation of the national politics. And anyway, her testimony has been probably the most decisive in most of these cases, just to her question. And as a consequence, any defense counsel wants to destroy that argument. So right now, we don't have the appeal yet in the Jesuits case, but it's natural. The defense counsel, unless you are a horrible defense counsel, will go against the most poignant evidence. And her testimony places Montano just to go straight to the facts, her testimony places Montano in the key meetings where the decision to kill the Jesuits took place. So naturally, he's going to contest that, of course.
Thank you. That may also approach one of the other questions we had, was to talk a little bit more about the case itself. Is there anything, there's another question I want to ask him here in a minute, but is there anything else on the case of how you work here and worked abroad and how it was tried? Anything else that you think we ought to know on this specific case?
I just, after 12 years of litigation and 30 since the 31 for these persons coming since the crime took place, perhaps the only thing I will say is that it also took place during a pandemic where everything had to be televised. And then I think the most important part of the case, naturally, is in many ways, obviously the families, but also the people that came forward to testify. And I had 2 reflections that perhaps I want to share, and it's too early, about these cases. When the people ask me, 12 years, how can you just, for 12 years and you're still doing this work, how can you be doing this? And as much as I believe that the lapse of time is the enemy of justice, and the justice to be just has to happen promptly, and I think that there's also something to say about time, and is that I never thought that I will have the witnesses that I had. I think 31 years needed to pass to have 2 military to testify against the military. And I also think that I will have never had 150,000 people from El Salvador watching the trial, but for a pandemic. So the whole idea of public happen in the most odd circumstances. So perhaps that's I keep thinking about whether I'm going to write about that or write it in my diary and never talk about it, but you gave me the opportunity because that was very unique.
Thank you. We have another question on what's the role of your faith in the work you do?
It's very central. I believe in I don't want to sound silly, but I believe in the little miracles that the people that come to my work and my life do on a daily basis. And as I said before, my work has been defined. I don't believe in coincidences. I don't believe in serendipity. I don't believe in all of those things. I do believe in these humans bringing whether it's the peace or the criticism or the energy to keep going. So, and it is that it's like a kind of hits me in the chest. So it is central, and I know what it is, and I know who it is, and it's central to my work.
Thank you. So following up on that, and this is the last question I have. If anyone else has any questions, please put them in the chat. But
David, there's one more technical one you might want to get to from Karen Alschuler at the end there. It's about a statute of limitations at the very bottom.
well, there it is. Okay, sorry, I didn't see that. The question is, let's see, will you be, okay. I don't see it, David. Help me.
Allow me to read it. The question is, can the International Court charge for a crime where there are no individually named victims? And how is the statute of limitations applied here?
Thank you.
In this particular, if I understand the question, in this particular case, in the Jesuits case?
It could be two different questions. The first question could be, can the International Court charge for a crime where there are no individually named victims?
Yes. Yeah, when a national court can, prosecutors have the ability to bring cases, and private prosecutions even in some countries, to bring cases appealing kind of the public interest, so to speak. Even if you don't know a victim or you don't have a relative of a victim, a certain standing, you could, depending on the crime. And again, this goes literally, the question can be answered differently, but in the same way. It really all goes to what crime you're dealing with. When it comes to a statute of limitations, we began this case alleging, which we believe they are, the law didn't allow eventually because of the reforms, but this is a crime against humanity. Crimes against humanity have no statute of limitations. There is never, ever, ever a limitation. In there are many other, in genocide, I mean, all the crimes, I would say that without going very specific, but including this Rome statute and consider torture, crimes against humanity, genocide, perhaps the more war crimes, the big ones that perhaps we hear more often, carry no statute of limitations. So technically, and that was a decision of many countries. I mean, that's a consensuated decision on the treaties and conventions. So that's kind of the exception.
And the other part of that question, I did find it finally. The other part of that question is, can an international court or using jurisdiction, can they charge someone for a crime where there are no individually named victims?
Right, and exactly, yes, they can. In fact, the International Criminal Court very rarely looks at a crime, for instance, or a perpetrator in relation to the identity of the victims or requiring anything. Perhaps it's even a criticism because it loses a little bit of the grounding reality of these trials. But generally speaking, international criminal law, and if you look at Colombia, or the justice and peace process prior, which, as I said, for me is a little criticism, but focuses more on the perpetrator than on the victim. It's really about going after them or getting them to speak and say the truth in exchange of maybe some benefits. So it is really the justice. It's really the justice for the perpetrator. I mean, it really has that angle. So many instances you can begin or start these processes, unfortunately in occasions, but not necessarily putting the victims up front. I think that's a little bit of a struggle and a pending thing for all of us to improve.
Okay, thank you for helping clarify that. We've gone a little over time here, so a couple final questions. My suspicion is there's not a big Anglican or Episcopal community in Spain. How did you happen to find your way to St. Mary's?
I love this question. David, I'm the rector. I may have to go a little personal here, but it's very true that it's not large, but I've been inquiring, and two of my best friends in the Episcopal Church, who David, our rector, knows well, actually were trained in Spain and went to seminary in Spain. So I think there is a deeper tradition, but it is true. So I was raised, I'm sure nobody is surprised with that. I was raised in Spain, I was raised Catholic. And I always had a deep problem with the Catholic institutional church, as I'm sure that that's not a surprise to anybody. And I never ever, my beliefs are deep in that kind of change. And I'll tell you what I think about, thinking a lot about the obviously the origins of the Anglican Episcopalian, particularly the Democratic Anglican Church as it developed in the United States. And a lot of friends during this profession, I don't think it's a surprise, and I don't say in this call just because it is that some of the most important solidarity work in Latin America in the countries and in the United States has been done by the Anglican Church, but hands down. And some of the most radical, perhaps Catholic Church, which if you allow me, are the Jesuits. I always move myself into waters, if this terrible metaphor makes sense. It is Anglican Church colleagues and religious leaders and then the Jesuits. And then something, so there's always been that debacle, and I never felt, a contradiction. I was just, so this is what I call the Anglican Church, the Christian kind of evolve. I was always more comfortable because I was able to be with women that had joined the active role in the church, whether as a rector, as a deacon, and they could tell me the stories of when women counted differently. The LGBT community, Spain is 20 years behind the United States on the LGBT, so I belong to the generation that we were fighting for that, and I was able to express those aspirations and those concerns with my friends of the Anglican Church. So. And then I choose an Anglican priest who's a dear person, Ed Bacon, former rector of All Saints Pasadena, as the person who will marry my husband, to my husband, I suppose, no, to marry. And Ed Bacon, who David knows quite well, and is a person that has guided as I said, when John Cortina, this Jesuit, passed, Ed has been very, very proximate to my heart and very keen on understanding, things that happen to us, why they happen to us, and, how do you live and what is spirituality for you. And anyway, at some point last Christmas, and sorry that to go too long, but it was very important because I hate to do this as sounds like I'm going shopping, but that's not the truth. Is that my son has two step siblings who grew up in the Episcopal Church that he adores. They are obviously teenagers, older teenagers, and I wanted to raise my son in the church, and I cannot take him, I'm sorry, to the Catholic Church. I couldn't, and I haven't not been doing it as a consequence for more than 3 years. So in Christmas, I had this moment, and I did reach out to Ed that I wanted to do it, that I think I'm going to raise Diego, and I think in the church, and then I think it will be the Episcopal Church. And then I got this moment of peace when I decided. So where to go? I'm a true, this is, maybe a silly, so I apologize, but I believe in connected. I believe in when you guys, when my rector and those beautiful, homilies, and they talk about love and how do you connect with people. I just see it. I just feel it. Are people that's what I'm suffering this pandemic, because I don't see the people and I cannot touch, the people. And that's what I get energy from. And then I start looking to see what will the sign be? What will the sign be? So then I live on the Steiner Street of Alamo Square. Always drove up home Steiner Street and always saw that beautiful church in that corner of Steiner and Union that always got my eye. And look at this. And so I read about St. Mary's. I read about some of the perhaps hardest things that St. Mary's went through with changes of rectors, and everybody knows better than me. And I reached out to a couple of friends in the city that belong to the Californian dioceses, including Bishop Mark, who's not a friend, but is a person that, anyway, and then St. Mary's had these this potential. And I just want to tell this, but it involves both of you, so I'm sorry that this is too long. But then everybody should know that then Noah Bullock, who is the executive director of Cristo Sal, a nonprofit founded by the Anglican Church 20 years ago, phenomenal organization in El Salvador. And Noah is a dear friend, says, hey, I'm going to San Francisco. I have some different conferences and tours, and I'm going to be at St. Mary's next Wednesday. My first day at St. Mary's was a Sunday. I believe our rector was on leave, vacation, or somehow busy, so I never met him that day. And then Noah said, well, don't worry about it. I drove you to St. Mary because I know exactly what it is. So I went and I met you, David, now David Grosson, and you took me out to lunch right away, which was wonderful, and explained to me. It was kind of feeling it. It was like everything was coming until you asked me, so what do you know about the Anglican Church? And I mentioned my husband's ex-wife and my stepchildren. And then I mentioned to Ed Bacon. And then you said, oh, Ed Bacon, who did you say? And I was like, yeah, the former rector of Los Angeles. And I was like, I'm pretty sure that was our rector's boss or mentor. Or I was like, you got to be kidding me. And then I left the lunch and I texted Reverend Ed Bacon. And I said, oh, I just met him. It was like, God bless you. You came to. David is amazing. And this is going to be your coffee, because he was on my moment, so to speak, very part of that. It's like, that's it. You did it. You found it. So with all those ridiculous ways of connecting, I said, okay, I'm not gonna, this is it. So that's what brought me, all of you brought me to St. Mary's.
And I'm going to just jump in a little bit too, because the Holy Spirit, she's crafty, because was the rector of the first church I worked for in the Episcopal Church. I learned and still learn from him. He is a friend, but also a deep mentor. And so the fact that we are both connected to him still, and that we should wind up together with Noah Bullock, it's just the palpable presence.
There was no question.
I want to celebrate that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think we have, it's been a wonderful evening. It's been a spectacular evening. We have learned so much. I can't tell you how much we appreciate the work you do. We do have one final question before David concludes, and that is, there's got to be a takeaway for us. There's got to be a request for us to do something. What can we do? What would you have us do? Can you send us to a website? Can you send us to an action step? What would you have us do?
Well, I would love, if you are interested, for you guys to get to know better myself, but of course, but this is enough for Almudena for a year, but Guernica and the work that we do, the webpage seems to be the business card, but I will say, and this is all very raw, so I don't have a date, but we're planning in this crazy Zoom era, a virtual gala. I don't even know what that is called, but apologies, but some taking advantage of so this is 12 years, and a lot of people and 2 organizations were part of this case. So a way of honoring somehow in a dynamic way, and of course we fundraising as well, but so many people in the Jesuit community, in the Anglican community were involved. So we were thinking about creating this virtual gala. We will have details very soon. So if you want me to share, and then we can share with those who are interested, I think that could be a good opportunity. And it's one of those things that you can enjoy in your living room nowadays. So it's
as the one of the 2 people controlling the Justice Ministry's mailing list, get it to us and we'll get it out.
Excellent. And that would be super. Thank you.
Anybody here who wants to just Google any of those Guernica names that we talked about earlier, do it and find the organization, because they're marvelous. Thank you so much for your time this evening, for the work you've done. David, would you like to send us out?
I just want to let everyone know that this recording will be available on the St. Mary's website probably next week. We will have a paragraph attached to it that will include all these things that have been mentioned. I want to encourage you to go there, send your friends there, share the video widely so this story can continue to be shared of God's grace made very palpable in our world. I want to thank David Crossan for structuring and inviting this great opportunity, and Almudena, I want to thank you, not simply for this opportunity to hear the story, but for your witness, your passion, your persistence, and your deep love for the human experience in these tremendous ways. So thank you. It's an honor and joy to be, with you at St. Mary's. And I just want to say, to the extent that we can support you and others like you, we certainly want to do that, because that is what God is calling us to do. So, and unfortunately, when I end this, we're not going to be able to chat more. So I'll say goodbye now, and we'll chat again another time. But blessings to all who showed up. Almudena, David, thank you so much. Peace to you all as home, and we will see you later. Peace and blessings. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye. Thank you.